Way. Good afternoon. My name is Bill Shambra, and I'm director of Hudson Institute's Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal. Kristen McIntyre and I welcome you to today's panel entitled IRS plus 501c4 equals SOS, question mark. As you cannot have failed to notice, the nation's capital has witnessed a controversy since this past summer, simmering slowly on the back burner, always threatening to move to the front burner about goings-on at the Internal Revenue Service's Exempt Organizations division. The redoubtable Tax Prof blog helpfully runs a daily list of links to articles about the controversy, and following its daily pattern, the title of today's list is The IRS Scandal Day 132. And thanks, incidentally, to the blog's Paul Karen for the online shout-out about today's panel. For some observers, scandal is indeed not too strong a word to describe the behavior of the IRS. After all, they claim, beginning several years ago, the Exempt Organizations Division pulled aside applications for 501c4 status. Organizations whose titles included words like Tea Party and Patriots, and after lengthy delays subjected them to an onerous and invasive set of clarifying questions, followed only by further delays. Some still await approval, some have simply abandoned the effort. Other observers insist that these problems were in fact nothing more than the usual misunderstandings and delays that one would expect from an already underfunded and overburdened bureaucracy faced with a sudden flood of new applications for a particularly ill-defined tax status. Nothing criminal has been done, they insist, and anyway, the IRS has fessed up and apologized. Today's conversation will take off from these immediate issues, but it will no doubt soon raise some larger questions about the need for clearer definitions of the activities under question, and perhaps even for a fundamental reorganization of our approach to regulating the nonprofit sector. This stellar panel we've assembled to discuss these questions includes Cleta Mitchell of Foley and Lardner, who has filed suit on behalf of some of the groups involved, John Pomerantz of Harman, Curran, Spielberg, and Eisenberg, and a key participant in the Bright Lines Project, an effort to clarify standards for tax-exempt status, and Marcus Owens of Kaplan and Drysdale, and a former director of the IRS Exempt Organizations Division. So, Cleta, why don't you get us underway, and you can either come up here or you can speak from there.
I'll start here.
The podium, good.
I'll start here and move back to the table for Q&A. But thank you very much, Bill, for having us. It's an honor to be with you today to talk about my favorite topic, and one about which my husband thinks I've become obsessed. And I also want to, I'm happy to share the podium with good friends, John and Marcus. I particularly want to say to John, although there was an old state senator in Oklahoma used to say, I'll be for you or against you, whichever will help you the most. And so I praised John with some trepidation, as maybe it might hurt his career. But John has been, John and I participate in a monthly group of attorneys who represent both liberal and conservative, Republican and Democratic groups, and sharing common concerns about agencies and different legal aspects. And John has been particularly, I think, sensitive to some of the things that some of us have raised, several of us have raised about unlawful release of confidential taxpayer information. John took a lead with another attorney in helping to prepare a letter signed by a number of lawyers across ideological and party lines, saying to the IRS some time ago, even before all of this became public, about some concerns. So I personally am very appreciative of John, even though he chastises me for being partisan. But not like me. But in any event, that's right. But I just want to make a couple of points, because I could literally talk about this all afternoon, and I think probably the rest of you have day jobs, and so you probably want to get back to them. But I think that the thing that I began to realize, and John can tell you this, I began to realize that something was going on with the IRS really in the fall of 2009, certainly by the spring of 2010, because I went back and looked at, over the course of the last decade, of organizations for which I had represented seeking exempt status, whether it was 501c3, C4, or C6. And the time frame in requesting and receiving a response from the IRS was weeks and not months, and the questions were normally confined to the application itself. Here's the information that you are required to submit, and we have questions about what you have submitted. And what began to happen in the fall of 2009, I had an organization that was a 501c4 applicant who did, by the way, this summer in July finally get its C4 status. It took from October 2009 till July of 2013. And this organization was, it was established really to mobilize grassroots opposition to Obamacare. And we submitted in October of 2009, and then I heard nothing. They cashed our check, by the way, so I knew they got the application. And we heard nothing until June of 2010. And at that time, they wanted copies of all of the TV ads that the organization had run against Obamacare. Now, let's think about the time frame. It's the fall of 2009 and the spring of 2010. What was going on? Obamacare was moving through the Congress. And there was no election. They really, other than the Scott Brown special election in December of 2009, in which they were not involved. So these were genuinely grassroots lobbying, calls to action. Call your congressman, tell him or her to vote against Obamacare. And the IRS wanted a CD-ROM of all the ads. And I had a conversation with the agent in the spring, in June of 2010 after I got this letter. And he told me something. Now, we've been through a series of agents. I call them our parole officers because you have to check in. I would check in with them. I've gotten to know them. Hey, I'm checking in. It's my monthly check-in call. He told me something that really was startling to me. He said, you need to understand something. He said, the people I deal with here don't understand the difference between C3s and C4s. I said, oh, come on. He said, no, I'm not kidding you. He said I keep trying to remind them that this is a C4, and it can engage in unlimited grassroots lobbying. He said, but they keep thinking that these are C3s, and of course we all know that C3s are limited in the amount of lobbying in which they can engage. Now, Mark may find this hard to believe, but I found it quite credible because I have subsequently, went through with this particular organization 4 separate parole officers, and I had when they changed. When I would call, finally they changed agents, and the woman who was the supervisor, who I noticed is listed on one of the emails that Lois Lerner. The Lois Lerner emails that were released last week. And she told me, she said, well, we're going to transfer this case to someone who better understands your type of organization. And I said, well, what type would that be? And she said, 501c4s. I said, so you're telling me that it is not generally understood by your employees as to what C4s and C3s do differently. She said, that's right, but we have someone who really kind of better gets what C4s do, and we're going to have her work on this. It took another 7 months before, and she said, we're going to expedite this. I guess in IRS speak, that's expediting. And then I began to have these same kinds of problems with other organizations. I must tell you at the outset, I blame Chuck Grassley because I figure anything that's wrong with the exempt organization world has to be Senator Grassley's fault. But then when we got all those letters in the spring of 2012, then I knew something was really crazy going on because the kinds of questions that we got bore no resemblance to the applications. They were indeed, in fact, and I have to tell you, this is still going on because I've just gotten another round of letters for some of my clients who refused to take the deal the IRS offered this summer, which is another thing that they totally made up out of whole cloth. But the kinds of questions were pages and pages with subparts and subparts. And I redacted all of them for several clients and took them to the luncheon that John and I attend. And I said, guys, what is this? See all these letters? See these questions? Are you guys getting any of these letters? Are there liberal organizations getting any of these kind of letters? and took them to Congress and to the House and Senate staffers and said, you guys have got to ask questions about this. Something is going on at the IRS. So, you know, when Lois issued her now famous, infamous apology and blamed these rogue, low-level employees in Cincinnati, I knew she was lying. I can't put any more lipstick on that pig, because that's a lie. She lied. And we know she lied, and the evidence that keeps coming out is more evidence of the lies. But the first thing she said, well, this was all happening in Cincinnati. Well, you know that group that I told you about that filed in 2009? It was never in Cincinnati. I dealt with Washington from day one, always. In the fall of 2011, one of my clients who had submitted its own makeshift application, and had in July of 2010, and came to me a year later and said, you know, we haven't heard anything, will you help us? So we supplemented it, and I called the agent in Cincinnati and said, we're going to supplement this application, because I could see that they could use it beefing up. And he said, well, you can send it, but all those decisions are being made in Washington. So I sent the letter in the supplement in November of 2011, and I called him back in December and said, and to ask him to please forward it to whoever in Washington was making the decision. So I knew she was lying. At the moment she said, well, this is something in Cincinnati, I know nothing. And, you know, so what does that say to us? I mean, this is still ongoing. We're still getting the letters. This is not over. It's not in the past tense. So what do? Three things I want to say. Number one, this is what happens when you depart from the rule of law. There's a standard application. There are instructions. These applications are not on the back of a postcard. They are duly promulgated and published, and they have been in existence for a long time, and there's been a process. And what they did was they departed from the standard procedures, and they began making it up as they go along. They are still doing that. They call it, well, we do this by facts and circumstances. That's a lot like, I don't know obscenity. I can't define obscenity, but I know it when I see it. That is hardly a legal standard for dealing with the citizenry. So the fact is, this is lawlessness, and this is what happens when you get agents in any bureaucracy who behave in a manner that departs from the rule of law. Number two, it's still happening. Number three, I don't care what the majority or minority picket in the House or Senate say, this was targeting conservatives. And I'll give you the example. I don't know how many of you saw the document that USA Today published last night. But it is a memorandum from November 2011, which lists 100 and some odd groups that have been are in a report. Almost all of them conservative or Tea Party groups. There is one, however, and it describes them. And for instance, it talks about some of my clients are on that list, where it talks about, I mean, they basically describe the language and the issues that the conservative groups want to engage in such a way as a lot of campaign rhetoric reference to taking back the country after the elections. The attachment includes emotional rhetoric, nothing objective or informational, viewpoints and positions unsupported by facts. Since when does the government get to decide whether our positions are valid or not? I think this is pretty scary stuff. But I will point out that one of the groups on this list of 180-something or whatever it was, there are a couple of left or liberal progressive groups. One is Progress Texas. And the comments note that this organization had a lot of anti-Rick Perry rhetoric. They notice, I will point that out, that organization got its C4 status. My clients who never mentioned a candidate or a campaign or any kind of campaign intervention are still waiting for their C4 status or C3 status and have still gotten additional letters. So, and the final thing I will say is my solution is not to create more regulation or more legal standard. My solution is to remember this. When you're talking about bright lines for 501c4s, remember, there are 29 separate sections under 501c. If we're going to start talking about 501c4 bright lines, that needs to apply to 501c5s, labor unions, 501c6s, trade associations. The labor unions documented by the Wall Street Journal between 2005 and 2011 spent $4.4 billion with a B, dollars, on partisan campaign intervention. And when you were talking about somehow all this focus on 501c4s and we have to stop their political activity, really? Well, we're going to stop it for everybody or nobody. And the other fact of the matter is, and I think this is unconstitutional, that 501c4s and 5s and 6s are supposed to pay a tax on their political expenditures. I don't know how you can say that that's constitutional to tax people on political expression, but that's the law. And so I think that what needs to happen, frankly, my solution would be to abolish the Exempt Organizations unit altogether. I think it is so corrupt, it can never be retrieved. You know, Red Book magazine, I'm really old. When I was growing up, it had always had these features every month. Can this marriage be saved? I don't think the Exempt Organizations unit can be saved. I think that the decay and corruption and dishonesty and partisanship is so deeply rooted that it cannot be salvaged. And I think you should just rip it out and subject everybody to, you know, if I want to start an LLC, I don't have to ask the government's permission. I just start an LLC. I can be subject to audit. Audit should actually be on a random basis and not because you gave money to or raised money for a Republican presidential candidate. I know that's a novel thought these days, but if you had random audits and just, you know, because what they're doing now is essentially it's tantamount to audits in advance of recognition. So I'd just get rid of the whole lot of them, reassign them to, you know, some other task or job. I wouldn't let them go to the audit unit, but I don't think that this can be saved by adding a bunch more regulations, no matter how well-intentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Cleta. Cleta and I agree on a lot, actually. A lot of what she said I agree with. I think we probably diverge most in the characterization of what happened, but I don't think there's anybody on this panel who is happy with the fiasco that took place at the IRS. And the only question is whether it's a departure from standard procedure or not. I think that it is a scandal that clearly the IRS, and I would argue some of the groups that were applying for recognition of their tax-exempt status, did not understand what the requirements were for the tax-exempt status that they sought, or what political activity was. I think it's a scandal that it takes years and years and years for a ruling to be issued on whether or not these groups meet this. I think that, Cleta, you're right, that there's a certain amount of trying to audit in the determination process going on, and I don't think that's what should happen. But I also want to say that there is a role for some tax entity, whether it's the Exempt Organizations Division as it exists now, or some new audit function that Cleta will be unhappy with later, or some new thing that Mark comes up with, that there's going to be a role in the tax system for figuring out what is or is not political activity, as long as we want to make a decision in this country as a policy matter of the degree to which we're going to subsidize partisan political activity, whether we're going to allow people to give tax-deductible contributions to 501c3s and then allow those organizations to engage in some election-related activity, whether we're going to allow businesses to deduct the expenses they spend on political activity or for that matter lobbying, whether we're going to allow their dues-paying members or donors to 501c4 or 5 or 6 or C19 veterans organizations to deduct as a charitable contribution or a business expense the money that they give to organizations that those organizations then turn around and use for political activity or lobbying activity. You're going to need somehow a set of rules for what is political activity if you're going to have standards that rely on a functional definition of that. I want to depart from Cleta a little bit and say that this is not the first time we've been to this rodeo. If you want to go back 10 or 15 years, there were questions about how the IRS was handling groups that were advocating for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered rights. More recently, the IRS consolidated and agonized over and languished the applications filed by groups that sought to do journalism from a 501c3 organization. I've represented groups like that. Mark, I know, has as well. So it's not unusual for the IRS, when faced with something that they don't understand or don't do very well, to take too long, to the detriment of the tax-paying or the not tax-paying organization involved. It's not the first time that there have been awful, inappropriate questions asked. Before this most recent nonsense, I had a client who was asked to print out its website and to explain what exactly they meant by the word progressive when they said they were going to work on progressive issues, and to produce burdensome responses to multiple rounds of questions. This is not, unfortunately, unique. And it's true that the IRS's staff capacity and their understanding of the laws that they're charged with enforcing is, to put it charitably, uneven. I have an ongoing audit that hasn't had its original auditor, we've been through a couple, not understand the rules governing C3 lobbying, to the point where I printed out the IRS training manual on this and said, here, read this. You guys wrote it. The questions about whether or not communications by the organization were emotional or supported by facts actually does have a long-standing tradition. It comes from the Supreme Court slapping down the IRS in the Big Mama Rag case. And the IRS came back and said, okay, we're going to come up with this methodology test to determine whether or not something's educational. And one of the criteria is, are we being, is what we're writing, does it appear to be an appeal to emotion, or is it substantively, objectively supported by facts that you can document? So this stuff's out there. The taxation of this activity, it's actually a tax not on political activity, but rather on the lesser of your political activity or your investment income, so as to put tax-exempt organizations on an even playing field with non-tax-exempt organizations, so that the tax-exempt organizations aren't subsidized in activities that other organizations are obliged to pay for. And while I'm sort of doing a little fact-checking before I get to the meat of this, let me also just say that I want to quibble, Bill, I'm sorry, with the title of the panel. I think that, yes, 501c4s have been much talked about, but I want to note, and Cleta noted, that a bunch of those that have been subject to the latest abusive behavior by the IRS were C3s. A third, I believe, of those that were consolidated in this advocacy project that we've much talked about were 501c3s. So we can debate all day about why this occurred, and I don't think we'll convince anybody. Some of us believe it was dysfunction of the rules and the IRS, and some of it believe it had more malign purposes behind it, and I don't think we'll ever know. But I do think that we do need to fix this. And I think that there are ways to do that, and the group I've been a part of, the Bright Lines Project, offers one of them. In the wake of the current IRS scandal, it was apparent that the IRS itself didn't understand what was meant by intervention in a political campaign, what it was that 501c3s are prohibited from doing, what it was that C4s and 5s and 6s are not allowed to do too much of, what it is that donors are not allowed to claim as business deductions or else force their organization to which they donate to pay a proxy tax. What is this political intervention stuff? Cleta points to the IRS facts and circumstances test and complains about it, justifiably so. The IRS says it's political campaign intervention if, based on all the relevant facts and circumstances, it looks like it's political campaign intervention. That's really hard for an organization to act in a compliant fashion. It's really hard for a low-level IRS employee, or hell, a high-level IRS employee, to be able to evaluate and tell you whether or not you're going to be in trouble for engaging in that activity. People have been saying that 4 years. People have been complaining about the IRS facts and circumstances for years. Some of us have tried to do something about it. Some people have sought to take the IRS to court to get them to justify their facts and circumstances test, but the IRS tends to wiggle out of those situations. Mark represented a church out in Pasadena, All Saints Episcopal, that was subject to an extended audit, and the IRS ultimately sort of gave up and waved their hands and said, well, we think you did something wrong, but there's no penalty, we're out of here. Others have had similar circumstances. People on the left, people on the right, people in the middle. A lot of us have complained to the IRS and said, look, you have rulemaking authority. You should write regulations to talk more explicitly about what is and is not political campaign intervention. And to the credit of the IRS, they've tried a little bit to help. They've offered example-laden revenue rulings over the years, most recently in 2007, that provide some guidance on this. But we're still down to, we know it when we see it. What are the facts and circumstances? So about 4 or 5 years ago, a bunch of us who practice in this area, pointy-headed tax lawyer types, said, let's see if we can write the regulations that we've been wishing for if the IRS can't. Let's see whether we can write a set of rules that clearly define what is or is not political campaign intervention. This Bright Line project, as it's now called, was led by Greg Colvin of Adler & Colvin, who at the time was the chair of the ABA Tax Section Exempt Organizations Committee Subcommittee on Lobbying and Political Activity. Got that? Long title. Greg, with my partner Beth Kingsley, who's now co-chairing that subcommittee, and a bunch of us other wonky types, sat down and started to figure out what are the rules that we could live with. And we took as our model a set of rules that were initially enacted by Congress in 1976 and then fleshed out in IRS regulations of 1990 to define what exactly lobbying is and how much lobbying C3s can do. And as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, the amount of lobbying is limited for a 501c3 organization. So we came up with these rules, and then we were expecting at some point that there would be that aforementioned court case or some interest in Congress, and we'd be ready to go. Little did we suspect, as we sat there in the ABA meeting last May, that it would come in the form of a ham-handed disclosure by the IRS of really awful behavior when it came to determinations of politically or arguably politically oriented tax-exempt organizations. But we have that opportunity, and we rushed to release the document that we'd been working for these many years. So let me see if I can briefly summarize the set of rules that we came up with. First of all, it does apply generally. It's not just for C3s to determine what they can't do. It's also for C4s and 5s and 6s and 19s and everybody else, all the 501cs, all of which have some tax impact for how much political intervention they can do, how much electioneering they can do. The first rule we have is that it's always going to be treated as political intervention if you do certain things. If you endorse a candidate or a political party, you say vote for John Smith for Senate. If you contribute, cash or in kind, to a candidate or political party, or if you offer voters a clear litmus test and urge them to use that test to decide who to vote for. So only vote for people who are going to support a flat tax is clear political intervention because you can tell who we want you to vote for. But that only covers a fraction of the communications that a tax-exempt organization is going to make. So beyond that, we need a set of rules. And our threshold question is, are you making a communication that clearly refers to a candidate and expresses a view on that candidate? That threshold question gets you to the point where we have to worry about whether or not you're engaged in political campaign intervention. But even if you fall within that broad category, we offer several exceptions for speech that we think should not be treated as political campaign intervention. One, if you're legitimately advocating on a live public policy issue, something that the current office holders might take action on. So if you need to lobby Congress or urge an agency to take action on a rule and you need to criticize an elected official in the course of that, that's still going to be okay. Nonpartisan efforts to educate the public on candidates, voter guides, are going to be okay, as long as you treat the candidates equally on that. You give everybody a chance to hang themselves with the stupid things they say. And in that voter guide, your organization can decide, can announce what policy positions you favor as well. You don't have to hide the ball when asking a candidate where they stand on the environment or jobs or crime or foreign policy. You can also make a response if a candidate says something about you or your organization. You don't have to just be mum when a candidate criticizes you because you're the dreadfully liberal ACLU or the gun nuts at the NRA. You can respond, and it's not electioneering. And finally, we have one exception that allows preachers at the pulpit or people at the annual meeting of the group to speak truthfully without censoring themselves about what they think about the political situation, as long as that isn't some surreptitious effort to make a broad public statement. This is not something that you can record and put on the internet and hope will go viral. It's got to be you talking to a room full of people. And if you do that, that's not political intervention either. That seemed like a pretty good set of rules. Most of these exceptions don't apply if you want to use paid mass media. If you're going to do a big television campaign and try and wrap it in one of these exceptions, most of the time that's not going to apply under these rules. But in general, that seemed to cover, I don't know, 70, 80% of all of the activities that a tax-exempt organization might do that might be called electioneering. But let's say that you're in that other gray area, the remaining gray area. Well, then we offer a return to facts and circumstances. Just like under the current lobbying rules, we can't foresee and envision every possible alternative, so we suggest that in those rare circumstances, the group be allowed to go to the IRS and explain why they did what they did and why it wasn't electioneering. And either the IRS will agree or they won't, or at least reduce the penalty if they thought they had a good reason. So let me wrap up and say, that's the basic proposal. The more detailed proposal was in the materials distributed and is also on the website that we have. But if you don't do something like this, you're going to have groups that are continuing to flout these rules, either because they're ignorant of the rules or because they're deliberately exploiting the ambiguity and the bad enforcement. You're going to have the IRS ineffectual at enforcing these rules because they themselves don't really have a clear idea of what is or isn't electioneering. And there's a good chance that the courts are going to strike down the facts and circumstances test someday when they can drag the IRS into court. And when that happens, we may be left with anarchy, with the Wild West, with some sort of you can do whatever you want tax-exempt organizations, or maybe you can do whatever you want as long as you don't expressly advocate the election of a candidate. I don't think that's a good solution. I think Bright Lines is, and it's an organic thing, and we welcome your suggestions and comments for ways to improve it. But I hope that we'll see some action in the IRS, in Treasury, or in Congress to move it forward.
Well, I appreciate Cleta and John's Pollyannish view of the world. I have a somewhat darker view of what's happening at the IRS. I think the system of oversight is fundamentally broken. It's not the Section 501c4 organizations. There are a tiny number of them. The IRS is struggling to process applications from all organizations. I looked at their website this morning, and it announces that they are beginning to process applications for exemption received in April 2012. Well, it said that same thing for about 3 or 4 months now, and it took about 5 months to get away from March 2012. So the number of applications that are hung up in the system somewhere is probably on the order of 40 to 50,000. I'm filing in tax court today on behalf of one organization. It applied for exemption back in July of 2012, and its purpose, it's related to the Catholic Church, its purpose is to raise money to restore monasteries in Jerusalem. That's all they're going to do. And they're going to keep all the records of, what's done with the money. They're going to check off the names of the monks in Jerusalem who are going to get the money against the specially designated nationals list at the Treasury Department. This application has been sitting for over a year at the Internal Revenue Service. There's nothing there, okay? Nothing there. These problems, the fissures started showing up back certainly in 2003. In 2003, the training manuals that John was assigning to its IRS agent to read, the IRS stopped publishing those. 2003. What that means is the training the IRS was providing took a big step downward. My understanding is they tried to fill in the gap with things like video conferencing and webinars and things like that, but nothing beat the training that was conducted, which consisted of 3 days of classroom training with a manual, that was the manual John was referring to, that was written especially for that year and the issues the agents would be using. So the agent would walk away after 3 days of lectures with a book of how to grapple with the issues. They don't do that anymore, and they haven't since 2003. Something has broken down in the communication of issues that are developing in the cases, whether it's applications or audits, and the decision makers, the policy makers who happen to work in Washington. Now, I don't know if Lois Lerner was lying or telling the truth, but my guess is she probably didn't know what was going on in the field. And some unusual things have been cropping up. In 2004, I represented a taxpayer who received notice of an audit based on a speech that had been given 3 months before. 3 months. The tax year in which the event occurred that triggered the audit hadn't closed. The tax return for that year had not been filed. Yet the IRS was beginning an audit. That's like the IRS opening an audit of John here because they think he's going to underpay his income tax for 2013. You won't know if he does or not until April 2014, but the IRS jumped in. And I had some strong words with IRS area counsel about that case. It was another example of the IRS. We refused to give any records to the Internal Revenue Service. Take us to court. And the Department of Justice ultimately decided they'd rather not go to court and enforce records out under those circumstances. So something was wrong there for that case to go forward at that point. The IRS could have waited a year for the return to be filed and then started the audit. But they didn't. They jumped in, 2004. John mentions another case, happened about a year later, the same sort of jumping in. A few years after that, I had an audit of a non-political organization. The revenue agent thought he'd save time by not bothering with the issuance of information document requests. That's the way a revenue agent in an audit requests information. Instead, he went to the internet and prepared a revocation letter based on what he'd been able to Google search without asking for confirmation from the organization whether it was true or not. Everything on the internet is true, of course, as we all know. That audit went on for 3 years. And I was brought in when a proposed revocation letter was issued. 3 years later, they got a no change. In other words, the organization was cleared completely once the record had been produced, once the records had been requested. Something was wrong there, and it wasn't a small thing. We're not talking political issues. We're just talking that the procedure, the process has broken down in some fundamental ways here. And this has been building for a decade or more. It just so happens it broke open like a fissure on a volcano over 501c4 applications. It could have been anything else, frankly. It could have been anything. It just so happens it was C4s. But there's something wrong here. And it goes back, I think, fundamentally to the fact that Congress has assigned it to the IRS to grapple with these issues like what is religion? Because religion has a certain preferred place in the Internal Revenue Code. What is it to be charitable? What is it to advance social welfare? Congress created these categories, said they have special tax status, but then didn't bother to go any further and define what they meant by that. Okay, leaving it to the Internal Revenue Service, which is basically a collection agency. You know, they're the people who go out and grab you by the ankles and shake the coins out of your pocket to fund the government. I mean, that's what they do. It's a collection agency. It's not constructed to decide what is a religion. Simply isn't. Those are immense questions of, you know, requiring PhDs in philosophy to grapple with something like that. The tax system is not the place where those questions should be asked. So if we're going to have any government decision-making about organizations being exempt from tax or not, we have to figure out a way to have that done in a form that allows for transparency. That is, people have to know what the rules are. They have to know how the rules are made. They have to know how the rules are enforced. It has to be done by people who are adequately trained. There has to be adequate staffing. They've got to have the resources. They've got to have computer programmers to create the software to take the Form 990, if that's going to be the return, and make it electronically accessible. You know, that takes resources to do that sort of thing. It doesn't happen by itself. And so if you assign the task of this kind of oversight of a non-revenue generating area to an agency that is charged with generating revenue, and the IRS commissioner is given a budget, and he or she has to decide how to allocate finite resources and generate revenue to run the government. When it comes time to put resources into tax-exempt organizations which don't generate revenue, what do you think the rational decision is at that point? The rational decision is to give the dollars to the people who are going to audit multinational corporations that are, you know, moving their income offshore. It's going to be giving it to a function of the IRS that actually collects taxes, real taxes, not one whose job is to decide whether somebody really is advancing social welfare or not, or advancing religion or something of that sort. There's nothing there for the Internal Revenue Service to do. They're not equipped to deal with it. So the question is, well, what do you do? What are some alternatives? And it seems to me the time has come for there to be a broad conversation about how the policing of the tax-exempt sector should occur. And I think policing is the right word. What you want is the boundary maintained between legitimate but taxable activity and activity that is found by our elected representatives to be worthy of exemption from tax. And right now, that's bumping around about 9% of our gross domestic product is outside the tax system in those Section 501 organizations of various kinds. So it's kind of an important question as to who's inside and who's outside. But I think the system we have now just isn't giving us what we need. It isn't drawing that line in a clear fashion, a consistent fashion. And we're getting a lot of turbulence here. So what could be done? Well, in my paper, this is a draft I started working on maybe 5 or 6 years ago and presented in a couple of places. It's the latest iteration. I propose something that it's not a governmental organization. It's modeled loosely on the way the securities industry is regulated. Looking back, not at the way it's done now with FINRA, but when I first came up with this idea, we had the old National Association of Securities Dealers, which was, in essence, deputized by the SEC to regulate securities dealers. Could pull their license to do business if they did something wrong. It was funded by dues, by fees paid by the securities dealers so they could work. So the NASD had the money to do its job. It didn't have to wait for Congress to authorize an appropriation. It could hire the talent it needed to hire when it needed to hire it, and it could get the job done. Now, you can quibble about whether it was the best way to accomplish it, but the whole point is it set up a system, a sort of quasi-private, quasi-public system of regulation that was funded, that could generate the rules in a timely fashion, communicate those rules to the affected group, and then enforce them. And it seems to me that's what we don't have now, and that's what we ought to have in this area. So with that, I'm proposing that the fix is not to simply write some definitions of what's political campaign activity, because the problem's bigger than that. It's far bigger than that. It's not fixing the facts and circumstances test, because frankly that's the test used in just about every part of the Internal Revenue Code dealing with tax-exempt organization. Unrelated business income tax is based on the facts and circumstances. What's related to an exempt activity? Well, depends on the facts and circumstances. So that it goes back to the way Congress writes its rules in this area, and it suggests to me that the real solution is going to require some significant change, not patches here and there, not the Commissioner Werfel's little deal for 501c4s, you know. That's not going to do anything. It's not going to be writing a few revenue rulings or a few regs. It's more fundamental than that. It's more fundamental than that. So with that, turn it back to you, Bill.
Great, thank you very much. You know, that deal has been mentioned a couple of times. Could somebody tell the audience in the transcript what the deal is?
Well, I'll start. The deal that was offered to the dozens and dozens of groups who have been held in abeyance and suspension and legal limbo, whatever you want to call it, purgatory, for some years now, was that for 501c4 applicants, if they were willing to swear under penalty of perjury, that they would engage in no more than 40% of their expenditures and volunteer activities as being in the nature of political activities or partisan campaign intervention. I think although they use the term in the letter political, which is not the term of art that's used in the code and in the regs and in the revenue rulings, it is partisan campaign intervention. And that then they would issue, the IRS would in turn grant the C4 status. The thing that, I will tell you that my clients and clients of other attorneys with whom I've spoken, the thing that was most bothersome is, number one, that's just a made-up standard. And it did say, I mean, you have to sign it under penalty of perjury, and then you're going to be, the organization would be then held to that in their future 990 filings, permanently. And I think the thing that was, and it had to be retroactive as well. I mean, I think the thing that was most concerning is when normally what we think of is we look at, in terms of measuring the political campaign intervention in which a 501c4 engages, you look at the program expenditures. And, the idea of trying to figure out how many volunteers and what's the value of that? I mean, that all of a sudden, now then you've added something to the equation and you're really not sure. If you're going to have them out walking for a candidate, well, you could probably say, okay, well, did you have staff time, but how do you measure? I mean, I know the IRS on the 990 asks for how many volunteers did you have, and it does ask for a volunteer activity, but the thing that began to concern us, so now are these organizations going to have to do what lawyers have to do, which I would not wish on my worst enemy, believe it or not, is that you have to keep track of your time by every day, your hours. And so now then trying to say, okay, how many hours are we going to have I mean, if you have a candidate forum, for instance, and you invite the public and people come and they don't pay, well, is that a volunteer activity, and how do you calculate that? And so it was really something that, number one, the 40% threshold or ceiling was something that was just fabricated out of whole cloth. But that volunteer, how do you measure, calculate, and interpret the volunteer activity as part of program expenditures is, I was unwilling to recommend to anybody to sign that under penalty of perjury.
It's interesting to note, by the way, that even under the existing primary purpose test, it's not at all clear, because there isn't enough guidance, that it is an expenditure-based test, and indeed volunteer activity, however you define that and however you measure it, is probably considered. I actually give the IRS a little credit in offering this safe harbor. They should have acted on these applications a long time ago, and they should act on them immediately now. But they were hoping to at least let some of them who swore up and down, look, we're really not political, say, okay, fine, if you're really not political, agree to this and we'll give you the ruling right away. If not, you can hang on and we'll give you the ruling when we get to it. It should be quicker, but it's not. So.
Yeah, John and Cleta, I'd like to hear from both of you about Mark's plan. I mean, is this a doable proposition? I mean, oddly, Cleta, you seem to be most optimistic about the capabilities of the current IRS, i.e., they are devilishly clever at pursuing their political enemies. Your other two panelists seem to think that they're so hapless that they really couldn't execute the kind of strike on political opposition that you've talked about. But is it necessary, do you think, at this point, to go to something like Mark's complete overhaul of the system, or what's the story?
Well, as I said, I'd abolish the Exempt Organizations unit altogether.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it can be saved. I think that, you know, I'm willing to contemplate Mark's alternatives or whatever. I just think that as we know it, it needs to be uprooted and abolished. We need to do a fresh start, a start over. So if what would be better would be something along the lines of the NASD, having practiced before the NASD when I was practicing law in Oklahoma City, I can tell you that actually it was a system that worked pretty well for policing. But you know, the thing that, I mean, we can't just, and you know, and I want to go to something that John has said, and I don't disagree with John about this. I don't think that there's going to be some smoking gun where President Obama picked up the phone and called Lois Lerner and said, get these guys. I mean, that just doesn't exist. But what I do think is problematic is that we have had letters from members of Congress to the IRS and to the Exempt Organizations Unit saying, deny these Tea Party groups their C4 status. And we now know from the emails and information released last week by the House Ways and Means Committee that indeed they were reading the statements coming from the President, from the White House counsel, from others saying that C4s were engaging in these secret political activities and something needed to be done about it, and they could have, I mean, one of the articles that was forwarded by one of the IRS staffers to Lois Lerner was an NPR story about how the Senate was endangered by these shadowy C4 groups. And so look, I mean, do I think they're hapless? Well, yeah, when you have agents that don't know the difference between a C4 and a C3, and they're running the exempt, or they're in the Exempt Organizations Unit, and my clients' lives depend on their knowledge, yeah, I think they're hapless. But I do not think that it is, look, I mean, just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get me. And when you represent conservative organizations and you deal with the kinds of things that my clients deal with, whether they're conservative organizations that work on, that deal with trying to help college students on college campuses who are literally besieged and mistreated because of the sort of politically correct liberal orthodoxy that exists on college campuses. I mean, it is writ large in our society. That it is okay to beat up on conservatives because we're all you know, pig-headed, stupid, uninformed, and prejudiced and all, and so you might as well beat up on us because we deserve it. And why should the IRS be any different? I just say anything big in America is not friendly territory for conservatives, whether it's a big law firm like mine or a big accounting firm or big business, big government. Big in America is not kind to conservative principles. So I think to deny that prejudice exists among the leadership of the IRS would be to just be naive. But hapless, stupid, incompetent, yeah, all of the above.
Okay.
But also prejudiced against conservatives.
Right. John, is there
A brief response?
or Mark?
I don't know. You probably don't want to listen to me. I'm a starry-eyed liberal whose ideas can be safely ignored in this country. So,
I don't see much ignoring of this.
no. I think, look, it's clear that the current system is dysfunctional for all the reasons that Mark said. And whether or not you fix it in place, or you fix it in a new organization, or you fix it in something else, I don't know. Whatever entity is going to regulate the tax-exempt sector, and it needs to be regulated, then that entity is going to have a clear set of rules, and that's what I'm about. I worry a little bit, Mark, about industry capture of any regulatory agency. But I'm a starry-eyed liberal. But I think that it can be fixed. I don't think Mark's idea is necessarily bad. I just would want to see the details.
And I also don't think it's mutually exclusive when you're talking about the things that John is talking about in terms of having bright lines. And look, I actually do believe in bright lines. The Supreme Court said that in Buckley v. Vallejo, which is that when you're dealing in the First Amendment and political expression, that the Constitution, First Amendment jurisprudence requires bright lines. People have a right to know, as the court said, and people have a right to know in advance what speech is going to be subject to regulation by the government and what speech is not. And I think that when we engage in that area, it's important to remember that. And I do think that one of the things that I have noticed by all the things that have, from Stephen Miller's comments immediately after, you know, Lois apologized on Friday, and by Monday, Stephen Miller, who was then the acting IRS commissioner, was writing an op-ed that appeared in USA Today the next day. So between Friday, when Lois apologized, by Tuesday, Stephen Miller was saying it never happened, which is interesting. But I noticed that, and when his testimony to Congress, he uses what we think of as legal terms of art: partisan campaign intervention, lobbying, whether it's grassroots lobbying, direct lobbying. And those are things that we advise clients about. It's in what language there is in the revenue rulings or the regulations or whatever. And I noticed, and it's like fingernails on the blackboard, he's mixing advocacy. Well, is there a 501c organization of any number that doesn't advocate? I mean, I'm a Chi Omega. We are, what, a 501c7 or 7? You know, we advocate for Chi Omega. By golly, we're going to beat those thetas every time. But we advocate. Everybody advocates for whatever it is. And to say somehow that if you are an advocacy organization, that somehow, you know, the antenna should go up. I mean, where is advocacy per se as a term of legal art? And so I noticed that he used terms that were not the legal terms of art terms, and I think that's a problem.
Yeah. Let's go to the audience for Q&A. We have a terrific audience. Gary Bass from the Bauman Foundation has a question, and we'll just wait for the microphone, and speak very closely into the microphone.
Okay.
That's good. Excellent. Yes. Pretend like you're in a rock concert and you're the lead singer. Good voice.
Actually, Bill, what I'd like to do is flip your question the other way around, which is acknowledging, Mark, that there's dysfunction. And Cleta, you said the same thing. You would get rid of the EO division. And maybe we should be striving to some alternative regulatory structures, as you're suggesting, Mark, although I wouldn't call it a charity oversight board if we're talking about more than C3, so you might want to change your name. But I guess the question I would have for the two of you is, and Cleta, you started it just now, the reaction to the Bright Lines proposal itself. Ultimately, whatever entity exists, you're going to have some definitions. And I guess my question is, do these types of safe harbors make sense? And do these types of categories, are they logical? And I'm curious from a conservative point of view, as well as from having worked in the IRS, Mark, what your thoughts are.
Well, I think it makes sense to have bright lines. I mean, assuming you can get there with the guidance that Congress has provided. And the difficulty in writing interpretive rules based on a congressional statute in the tax-exempt organizations area is Congress doesn't like to provide the detail from which you can develop the rules. You know, they will use the word educational in Section 501c3 and just sort of let it hang there. The word charitable, you know, without any context. And it's very difficult. You can come up with a generalized definition, you know, by looking at perhaps, you know, common law definitions from the preamble of the Statute of Charitable Uses in 1601, which is incidentally what the Treasury Department did in 1959 to finally define charitable. But when you've got that kind of ambiguous terminology coming out of Congress, it's really hard to get to the kind of bright line standard that, you know, Cleta is legitimately asking for on behalf of her clients and John is proposing with his Bright Lines project. It's hard to say there's enough of a legislative hook there. So you have to, it becomes a very difficult task from the standpoint of the Treasury Department, which writes the regulations, incidentally, not the IRS. And for the IRS to come up with, you know, anything else.
You know, I think that Mark has really hit on something important here, and I think particularly, in short answer to your question, Gary, I do think that obviously we do need those bright lines, and we need them in the campaign finance context, and it would be nice if the campaign finance law and the IRS rules somehow matched, or were even anywhere close to being similar. And I think in terms of McCain-Feingold, for instance, one of the things that, this is a great example, it's not the same, but it tells us exactly what Congress does not do properly in this area. And when the Congress directed the Federal Election Commission in 2002, when it enacted BICRA, to adopt regulations governing coordinated public communications. And that was it. It said, well, it had a couple. It doesn't have to be express agreement to be coordinated. That's pretty much about all they said. And the FEC has now been, what are we on, our third or fourth set of lawsuits where the FEC promulgates regulations, and then, you know, Fred Wertheimer takes them to court, and the court agrees with them. They go back. I think we're back on, you know, the third or fourth round. It's been more than a decade. And it is all because of just exactly what Mark said, that Congress completely abdicated its legislative responsibilities. And I think that's a really good point. And maybe one of the things that we could all agree in is that the first step on a solution to all this, because I talked to a lot of groups about this, and I really, to me, I want to get to the bottom of it, but I really want to get on with fixing it. You know, I don't need to know any more than I know, which is that my clients have been subjected to horrible mistreatment and still continue to this day. I know that. And it would be nice to know why, but frankly, what difference does it make? Let's fix it. I'm like Hillary Clinton. What difference does it make? But but I do think that it's important, at least people haven't died yet, but I do think that it would be important for us to maybe get Congress to start with the process and adopt some specifics. I do think that along the lines of this are important. I do worry about, I tell you one area that I want to make sure we protect, and that is candidate forums, because I think that it is really, both the FEC and the IRS seem to look askance at candidate forums, and somehow those are problematic. And look, I mean, if you're the Nashville Tea Party, and you know, you probably are not going to have a lot of Democratic liberal candidates who want to come and talk to you. Now, you might have some, but you know, I just always say, well, invite everybody, but you're not responsible if they don't come. The problem is that sometimes even, you know, that the fact that they had the forum, both the FEC and the IRS say, well, yeah, but everybody didn't come. So I want to make sure we protect the right of citizens to gather and hear what candidates have to say. And so that's one area I'd want to really be very protective about, because neither the FEC regulations nor the IRS approach these days protect sufficiently, in my view, candidate forums. And that's one of the things that consistently I've seen questions about in these letters to Tea Party groups, that they had judicial candidates, or they had a candidate forum for a group of candidates, and who came and how much did you spend for that?
More questions? Yes, Scott, please.
Scott Walter, Capital Research Center. I have a question for the starry-eyed liberal, because of course starry-eyed liberalism specializes in unintended consequences. And I want to suggest to you that one of them, many that leap off the page to me, is you're allowed to respond to your critics. Now, most C3s and C4s work enormously hard, both to criticize and to get responses to their own criticism, and back and forth. And the more you can do that, the better off you are in fundraising and earned media. And you know, have you really thought through whether that's something you want to encourage further?
Yeah, we have. This was a very controversial exception, but we specifically, and I urge you to read the full explanation of this exception, but it was clear from past experience that candidates will demonize a group, or candidates will speak foolishly on a group's central missions, the thing that they know more in the world about than anybody else, and the group will be muzzled, unable to respond. Cleta talks about advising clients on candidate forums. Those of us who advise tax-exempt organizations on what can you say about that thing the candidate just said are frequently faced with the situation was, that's inane. That Republican or that Democrat said something insane about something that we know all about. Why can't we talk about it? Well, it might be electioneering under the facts and circumstances test. So yeah, we did think about it, and absolutely it's going to result in situations where there are C3 organizations saying things that make a candidate look dumb. And if that has an impact on elections, we're willing to take that consequence.
Congress may not be willing to take that. That may be the problem.
Yes, please, right here.
Got a microphone coming.
My name is Kim Pat. Hello. And I'm from the Foundation Center. And so we teach classes on how to start a nonprofit and all that good stuff. So one of the major questions that I'm asked is the hybrids that are coming up, like LLCs and B Corps. And I think that the lines are becoming more blurred, like the song Blurred Lines, than bright lines, seriously, because I think that the division between the for-profit and the nonprofit, many people are putting together these hybrids. Also with UBIT, more and more nonprofits are looking at earned income. So I think that it's going to be more difficult to have bright lines than less. So I think that, how would you address that? Because I think the field is ever evolving, and so the lines are less clear for sure.
Well, I'll start. I think there is always a tension between the world of preferred organizations eligible for various flavors of tax exemption and other things, and people trying to do organizations or clusters of organizations that want to do several of those things in concert. And I don't know that a Bright Lines project is going to address that, except insofar as some of that work is going to be related to what is or is not political. I sympathize. I don't think it's a new problem, and I think that it's going to require a well-resourced regulatory agency in or outside the IRS, to try and grapple with these emerging problems that you've described?
Well, you know, actually, I had a client who said to me the other day, and her organization is one that's been going through, they've been waiting since, I want to say December of 2000. I didn't do the application. I think it was December of 2010 when they submitted their application, and heard nothing from the IRS until February of 2012. But she said, I don't know why we don't just get rid of all these exempt organizations anyway. You know, she's the president of one. And just let everybody be what you say, you know, an LLC. You know, we get income, we have expenses. You know, we just get rid of all of this. And you know, I was a little bit hard pressed to explain why I thought that was a bad idea. You know, look, I mean, contributions to a C4 are not tax deductible as charitable contributions. I know very few people who take, and maybe John knows. I mean, I don't really, I know very few donors who try to deduct contributions to C4s as business expenses. The contributions, oh, they do that on the left, they don't do that on the right. But we know we'll get audited.
You all give to the chamber instead.
Well, but you know what? The contributions to the chamber, unless their membership dues, are not deductible, and they're not deductible to the extent that they're spent for lobbying or political expenditures. And so all the fundraising that the chamber does, because I've had clients who have given me the solicitation, say, can we give? And I say, yes, and it says right on there, this is not deductible. So, yep. You know, I mean, you know, when you file the lobbying disclosure reports, all the trade associations have to say, you know, I tell them how to prepare it, or the companies, and you have to exclude the amount of dues that, you know, are spent for lobbying percentage. And so, you know, I don't really think, when I was thinking about that, I thought, well, you know, those expenditures are not tax deductible anyway. So maybe that is the answer. Just, again, get rid of the exempt organizations unit, get rid of exempt organizations altogether, and let them be LLCs and pay taxes to the extent that they...
churches. Yeah, that'll work with your people, right?
No, I don't want to do the churches.
Oh,
but I'm talking about C4s, 5s, 6s, et cetera. Churches, I don't even know. I don't think churches should just be excluded altogether. And just let, you know, they shouldn't have, they're not subject to the review process if they don't choose to be part of it.
They don't. They have a special deal.
They should have a special deal.
Mark, would your organization handle the blurred lines problem? What do you think?
Well, that actually is a little different problem. I mean, the hybrid organizations are for-profit organizations. I mean, they have owners, and the profits of the enterprise, if they're owning, are going to be distributed to the owners. But it's a for-profit construct that intends to achieve some sort of additional societal goal, whatever that might be, in the eyes of the owners. And so the owners, you know, the owners sort of agree among themselves that what they're going to do is going to be guided by a principle that is not just returning personal gain. And we've seen this for a long time. I mean, there are, for example, investment funds that won't invest in, you know, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms organizations because that's anathema to their religious belief. They only want to invest in certain kinds of things. And it's the same idea that you know, your business philosophy is going to be guided by some set of higher standards.
And different standards.
Or
not necessarily higher.
Well, I'm sure they consider them to be higher. Yeah. But the point being that there has to be a line drawn between those organizations, which fundamentally are businesses and should be filing tax returns, and organizations that Congress decides, if they're going to decide to allow organizations to operate businesses and not pay tax, to have what would otherwise be taxable income. And I think if we're going to have that, I mean, one solution is what CLETA proposes, just eliminate tax exemption altogether. It then raises a question of whether you shouldn't also eliminate all the other benefits. I mean, my brother-in-law has 5 kids. I didn't. He gets 5 dependent deductions. I only had 3. You know, maybe you should, you know, sweep the board clean. What's this accelerated depreciation stuff corporations get? Come on, pay tax. You know?
Homeowners deduction.
So there's a certain irrationality to our tax system, and it may be so deeply embedded in our society that you can't really unwind it all. But
Yes, gentleman right here.
Hi, my name is Brian Zimmer, and I'm president of a coalition for a secure driver's license, and my comments are completely personal, not reflecting my organization. I came to this today, and I like a lot of the Hudson presentation materials. By the way, I compliment you on the excellent forums you run, because I was quite intrigued by the Bright Lines proposal. And I'm a former employee of the Congress in a senior staff position and worked directly with Ways and Means on a number of investigations. So I have a little personal experience, and I work directly with regulators from the IRS. Despite what Mark just said, the people I met with about IRS regulations were not from the Treasury, except to the degree that the Treasury controls the IRS. They were regular GS-15s who have been employed for the IRS their entire lives, writing regulations for the IRS. So it's a novel idea that somebody from Treasury would intervene. But earlier in my career, I did work directly with Treasury on a farm tax issue. So I think it varies by the subject matter, is my point. So the pointed question is, you have a very interesting proposal, seems to me to be very lucid, and it fits within existing frame of law, in contrast to Mark's proposal, which is interesting also, but there's no current legal reference for it. So if you just took existing laws, then a bill passed first through the Ways and Means Committee that would then move to action. And by the way, the Congress usually responds pretty favorably to what Ways and Means wants to do. So my question is, are you going to take this, are you advocates for your position of moving Bright Lines forward, which would help my organization and everybody here make decisions on a day-to-day basis? Because we, frankly, are often asked to take political roles, and we decline and hide in our research mode because we're not sure whether we're political or not. So we say, well, that might be political, so we won't do it. Yep. Now, there are other people probably in this room and that would say, yeah, let's go do it. It is political, and we're going to get ignored by this administration. We better look out when the next administration comes to town, because there seems, as you pointed out, depends on who's in charge, which organizations are looked at and investigated. Mm-hmm. So the idea is, let's have some objective standards that fit no matter who the president is. Yep. And I think that's an excellent idea. So the question is, are you going to do something to try to get, let's say, bipartisan support, which always helps move things through Congress?
We are doing something, I'm happy to report. We are meeting with congressional staff and members on both sides of the aisle and getting a fair amount of interest, and hope to look for opportunities to move legislation forward, perhaps in the context of one of the great tax reform bills, if any of those things ever take flight, but if not, perhaps in a more narrowly focused way. But if that fails, I note that as part of the blowback from the IRS fiasco that we're talking about, one of the recommendations of the Treasury Inspector General was that the IRS and Treasury should come out with better guidance for what exactly is political intervention. And it is on the priority guidance plan for upcoming regulation or guidance rather. And I think that within the scope of the existing vague congressional mandate, Congress, or rather the Treasury and the IRS, do have the authority to promulgate regulations in this area, and we are in conversation with them as well, trying to urge them to move it forward. Well, what a setup. Thank you, yes. BrightLinesProject.org, I believe, is the BrightLinesProject.org, which actually I believe is in the materials that you got.
Yes, it is.
So.
That's right.
Thank
you. Do remember the Bright Lines material and all the other material referred to here is, in fact, it was required reading. You guys know this. I know
required.
It's required reading. This is not recommended reading.
There's going to be a quiz, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have time for one more quick question. Yes, please. This is, I should apologize right now. I totally poached this panel, the idea, and 2/3 of the personnel for this panel from the Philanthropy Roundtable, Joanne Florino, and now she's about to claim credit for this, and I don't blame her.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I love you. And so my question actually is to go back to Mark and raise the issue that John started to raise, which was, it seems that to me that despite this latest episode at the IRS, that for the most part, this agency has behaved with the rule of law and in a very professional manner throughout its existence, despite the fact that most taxpayers want to find something wrong, some kind of bias because you didn't have any children, etc. But when you talk about an independent agency, Mark, I think John's question was he worried about industry capture, which has been an issue with SEC and some other agencies. So what kind of guidelines could be put into place? What kind of safeguards could be put into place? Because I think as part of the industry, my concern would be that there would be people appointed who had biases about, again, the same kinds of things. What is charity? Where does religion fit in? I mean, the list of questions goes on. So I'd love to hear you talk about how those safeguards would be ensured.
And as you point out yourself in the paper, you know, you had a criticism of independent sector, for instance, for being captured, their panel for being captured by some kinds of organizations and avoiding others.
I don't think there's any way to really build an impermeable barrier to that sort of capture. In fact, the IRS was captured in July of 2011 when members of Congress, Republican members, demanded that audits for gift tax purposes of gifts to 501c4s be stopped in mid-audit. I've never seen that happen. That's capture of an agency of the first order. You know, there are ways that difficult tax issues are resolved, and you know, some go to court, some don't. But to just have the deputy commissioner stop an audit in mid-audit is extraordinary. So I think capture exists. It's a real phenomenon. I think the only solution to it is, and I hate to use the word transparency, it kind of makes me want to gag, but all the proceedings should be open. You know, I mean, that's the only way, so that people know what's going on and how the decisions are being made, and then you can judge for yourself whether there's bias creeping in of some kind. But I don't think there's any way to, I mean, humans are human. They're going to do things based on, you know, all sorts of motivations. You just got to have a way to understand what's happening so that you can take steps, you being, you know, the public or the government, take steps to rectify it when things happen that are wrong.
Final comments, quick final comments?
Well, I just want to say the reason, in defense of those Republican congressmen who sent that letter, what was so objectionable was that the IRS just sort of out of the blue began to creep toward a new tax that has been discussed and sort of potentially hovering and real but not real, and assessing gift tax against those who gave contributions to 501c4s, and did not do it in a transparent manner where they said, all right, everybody, here's the notice, here's what's going to happen, we're going to start assessing gift tax if you give contributions to 501c4s of more than $11,000 in a year of 13 or whatever it is in a given year. They didn't do that. And so that, I think, was a surreptitious, non-transparent, sneaky way in which the IRS was going about that caused a great deal of alarm among some of us, and who were very grateful that the IRS, caught red-handed, stopped what it was doing in mid-process.
Just for the record, the federal government has prevailed in 3 court cases on the application of the gift tax to gift to 501c4s. It has not lost a single case, and it issued a revenue. That doesn't mean it isn't an issue that can't be litigated. It's just there's a record and the government's won.
Well, but let's also be very clear that it's not been common practice.
Well, and indeed, you know, the lack of enforcement, whether because of the ambiguity or the lack of resources or the fear, is certainly problematic, but it goes to some of the same issues that we are actually talking about at this panel. Which let me sort of say my piece, which is that I think that what we have with the IRS scandal is something both common in Washington scandals and unusual. It is perhaps unusual in that there's actually some substance behind it. There actually is a scandal there, the way these groups, Cleta's clients and some of my clients, were treated, and some are continuing to be treated. It is not unusual in that it has become a political football that people on both sides of the aisle are trying to use to score political points. But the most unusual thing about it is I think there's a real opportunity to solve a real problem here. And I think there are people of goodwill on both sides that are willing to do that. And that's really exciting.
Very good. Terrific. All right, let's give our panel a hand.